Emerson would have loved it. Thank you. When I heard Justin playing that, when I walked in, it's one of my favorite pieces, and it just fits in so well with what Mickey shared with you this morning, this understanding of Emerson at that time in his life especially, and I'll get into that in a minute, having this, astonishment, this period of celebration where he just looks up at the heavens and says cosmos, and that piece just kind of reflects that same feeling. I continue, I've been coming back to church for about the last 6 months, and after having been gone for like 6 years, it's wonderful to see so many new people here, and it's also kind of frightening because this is a whole group of people who don't know anything at all about me, and so I feel like a lot of times when I walk around or give sermons or talk, I need to go through introducing myself. So I want to share something with you that maybe even the people who were here for the last 35 years maybe don't even know about me, and that is that since middle school, I had wanted to be a minister. I don't know where the idea came from. Probably I grew up with really strong ministers who seemed to take me under their wing, never suggesting that I'd be a minister, but I never told anybody that I had this idea of becoming a minister. My parents didn't know. Of course, I didn't tell my friends, and especially my closest friend, whose father was a rabbi. I didn't tell him this. It probably would have destroyed our relationship. It's the kind of thing when you're in middle school, you don't go around telling your friends, I want to be a minister, because they would kind of look at you like you're a little screwy. Or other people might say, a minister of what? Which was the response I got in a lot of foreign countries when I would tell them I'm a minister. So there were no ministers in my family, or so I thought. Actually, it wasn't until I was here and I was going home to visit some friends in Cedar Falls, Iowa, that I learned that my maternal grandmother's uncle was a United Brethren minister. Now, the United Brethren and the Methodists merged in, I think, the late 60s to become the United Methodist Church. So there was this one person who was a minister, but we never talked about him. I never knew. And so it was really something when in the mid-'80s, my aunt got me invited to speak at this church, which is another story altogether that I'm happy to tell you at some point. But there was no pressure at all on me to become a minister, in spite of, now get this, in 8th grade, I won the village sermon writing contest. It was sponsored by the village's Christian Education Committee. I wrote a sermon on Abraham Lincoln. I still have it, big letters, and the big spaces, and it's really, really horrible. But I won, and it should have maybe been an indication to somebody that maybe I was going to be a minister, but no, it wasn't. And I'll tell you a little bit more in this moment how my calling evolved. But my point in telling you this story is that I don't know if you come from families where there are sets of expectations built on your family legacy of who it is you're supposed to be. But in 1803, when Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I'm going to just say Ralph Waldo Emerson once because it was in college that he told all his friends he wanted to be known as Waldo. So I'm going to call him Waldo. It was later on than 1803 when Waldo was born as Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was a 7th generation minister. The expectation was he would be a minister, and he was. Most of those ministers before him were all Congregationalists, but as you may know, if you know a little bit of your religious history of New England, Congregational, especially after the Revolutionary War, many of those folks became Unitarian and Universalists. So the last generations just before Emerson were all Unitarian ministers, which is what he became, Unitarian minister. But 7 generations, a little bit of pressure, huh? And that was in 1803. I really feel like to understand your faith, Unitarian Universalism, you have to have some understanding of Emerson. You've just got to. And I think you would be surprised. In fact, this hit me several months ago when John was preaching of just how relevant Emerson is to our faith today. I can't remember what it was, John. I think it was John was talking about nature, and it was just like he was preaching Emerson. I don't know if he knew it, but he was preaching Emerson. And it is so embedded in our belief that you've got to have some understanding of Emerson, and especially you need some understanding of his July 14th, 1838 Divinity School address at Harvard Divinity School, which is the subject, in a way, of my sermon this morning. 1838. We don't talk a lot about 1838, but in a couple of weeks it will be an anniversary of sorts for that July 14th sermon. Let me give you a little bit of background about Emerson. She was 16 years old when Ellen Tucker became infatuated with Emerson, and Emerson in turn became infatuated with her. He was tutoring in the state of New Hampshire. This is after he'd returned from Florida, where he had been suffering with tuberculosis. A little fact that I didn't know was that at this time, over half the city of Boston was infected with TB. Half the city was infected with TB. They were having their own kind of COVID crisis, worse than that. But he came home after being in Florida for quite a long time, having recovered. He wasn't finished with his degree yet. He went off to New Hampshire, where he tutored at a school, and one of those students was Ellen Tucker. They began dating eventually, and in 1829 they married. 1829 was an important date because it's also when he was called to the Second Unitarian Church of Boston. And 2 years after their marriage, she died of tuberculosis. When they were married, she had tuberculosis, and I guess they kind of felt like he had overcome it, so she would overcome it. Well, she didn't. She succumbed to it. So distraught was Emerson that on a regular basis, he would go to her tomb, the mausoleum, and he would open up the casket and just stand there and cry. He knew he couldn't do this for very long. His family was worried about him. His friends were worried about him. So he went off to Europe trying to settle himself, to center himself. And he spent most of his time in Paris, which he hated. He didn't like the museums, the art museums. He didn't like their social mores, which were very, very lax. But he did find some refreshment, oddly enough, at the Paris Museum of Anthropology, the Natural History Museum. And I say ironically because most anthropology museums, natural history museums, are just built on death, right? I mean, it's a lot of dead things, explanation of dead things. And yet, he was rejuvenated by this. So rejuvenated by it that when he came home, and referencing Mickey's reading in 1832, he gets totally infatuated with his brother's shell collection and starts talking in these Darwinian terms, which is a sermon altogether. Darwin and Emerson were peers. They didn't know about each other, and yet to read their science, their theology, it's like they were just reading from the same textbook. It's really quite incredible. So, in 1835, 3 years after this aha moment, he marries Lydia Jackson, whom he calls Lydian for some reason. He likes the name Lydian Jackson. And with Lydian, they have 4 children. Waldo, a young boy, Ellen, Tucker, Emerson. Lydian wanted their first child to be named, Lydian wanted their first child to be named after Emerson's first wife. Yeah, geez, I know. So, and then they had Edith and then Edward. That was in 1835. Let me say something about the women in Emerson's life. You know, it's my theory, and it's not only my theory, that behind all the great men of the world were at least one woman, if not a whole cast of women that made them great. And Emerson had that cast. He had his first wife, Ellen, who was brilliant. Lydian was far ahead of him theologically and politically. You know, we like to think of Emerson being this avant-garde guy against slavery and everything. No, it was Lydian. And Lydian pushed him and pushed him and pushed him, and finally he became anti-slavery. He also had his aunt, Aunt Mary Moody, who was a strong feminist. He had Louisa May Alcott. He had Margaret Fuller. And then he had the whole clan of Peabody women, Elizabeth Peabody, who was named after a queen, Mary Peabody, who was named after the Holy Mother, and Sophia Peabody, who was named after the goddess of wisdom. And what you need to know is this congregation has somebody from that lineage in it. We have Liz Vanderheuvel, who was born Elizabeth Peabody. 91, a descendant of the Peabody clan. You may want to seek Elizabeth out after the church. Rub shoulders with her, see if you can get a little bit of that Peabody magic going for you. It was Lydian and the Peabodys who really pushed Emerson to publish. So he publishes this book called Nature. And if I could have the slide on nature, the next slide. And in that slide, he asks this question: why should we not enjoy an original relation with the universe? And if you have to know anything about Emerson, this is what you have to know. Everybody should be able to quote Emerson, especially a Unitarian Universalist. Why should we not enjoy an original relation with the universe? Say that with me. Why should we not enjoy an original relation with the universe? This got him into so much trouble. Because if you carry that out and realize all the implications of having an original relation with the universe, why do we need teachers? Why do we need ministers? Why do we need the Bible? Why do we need Jesus? Why do we need God? Everybody deserves and can enjoy an original relation with the universe. This was in 1836. In 1837, he's invited, and I do not understand this, he's invited to give the address to the graduating class of Harvard Divinity School. And I have to say, what were they thinking? Here's a man who has left his church. He resigned in 1835 from his congregation because he refused to give communion anymore, because he didn't believe in miracles. And communion is based on miracles. And he simply did not believe in miracles. Why? Because we can all enjoy an original relation with the universe. We don't need miracles. So here they turn around and they invite him to give this address. What were they thinking? He left his church. He's talking about, basically, we don't need professors. We don't need divinity school because you can have your own relation to the universe. And so they invite him there. And who was there? There were 7 graduates of the divinity school. First of all, the divinity school auditorium is about half the size of this sanctuary. I've been there several times. It's teeny. There were 7 graduates. 6 of them came with their families. But who also came were all of the ministers of the area churches, the faculty of Harvard Divinity School, and a lot of college professors, including the president. He'd only been out of seminary 12 years. I do not understand what they were thinking. And here's what he told them. The first thing was he had the proverbial come to Jesus meeting with them. So he gave them his opinion about Jesus. Could I have that next slide? And here's what he said to them. Jesus spoke of miracles, for he felt life was a miracle. Thus is he the only soul in history to appreciate our worth. In other words, we are the miracle. He felt it was vulgar to speak of Jesus performing miracles. So he rejected all of those miracles that Jesus was performing in the Bible. What were they thinking? This was standard theological training. We are the miracle. And he said, if you want to explore that miracle, if you want to have an original relation with the universe, go into nature, because nature is where you will find a miracle. It is the miracle of being able to embody the divine, to meet God, to know everything that Jesus knew. Jesus is the only one who ever gave value to human life. And the second thing that he told them, and get this is the best part, because here are all these students graduating who are going to be preachers. The room is filled with professors who all are preachers. It's filled with Boston area clergy who are preachers. So here's what he told them. It is my duty. Who is he? 12 years out of divinity school. He left his church. It is my duty to say to you that the need was never greater of new revelation than now. Preaching is the expression of the moral sentiment and application to the duties of life. Whenever the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, then is the worshiper defrauded. The true preacher can be known by this, that they deal out to the people their life. Life passed through the fire of thought. Every Unitarian Universalist minister I know knows that by heart. Life passed through the fire of thought. But the bad preacher, it could not be told from that sermon what age of the world they fell in. What are they thinking? They didn't know this is what he was going to say. Not exactly, but they had a sense of what he had to say. As a consequence of all this, Emerson was not invited back to Harvard for nearly 30 years. Boy, talk about carrying a grudge. 30 years. Fast forward 132 years. Fast forward 132 years. 54 years ago, on April 22nd, 1970. Anybody know why that's an important date? Yeah, very good. First Earth Day. I was a sophomore in college at Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I was taking a class in American authors. We were studying transcendentalism. And we only had 3 authors to read for a whole semester. We read Thoreau, Emerson, and Whitman. And on April 22nd, 1970, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we had been assigned to read Emerson's Divinity School address by Professor Cogger. And when we came to class, nobody wanted to go to class. It was a beautiful April day. It was the first Earth Day, and nobody knew what that was going to be. And we convinced him to go outside for class. And he probably knew that nobody had read the address. I didn't read the address. Nobody had read the address. So he decided, yeah, let's go outside. So we go outside. And rather than having a discussion, we all sat down, this little cult around our professor, and he leaned up against a tree, and he read to us the Divinity School address. And I still get emotional about this, because this was my calling. It was like he was channeling Emerson and speaking to me. So you've got to understand, when I was a child, and really up until that moment, you hear people talk today about being spiritual but not religious. I was religious but not spiritual. I loved church, but I had no idea why. I had no sense of spirituality until April 22nd, 1970, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Dr. Cogger read that lecture. And it was just like, whoa! Now it all makes sense. He was describing something that I had believed in since I was a child. And after the class was over, I came up to Dr. Cogger and I said, what religion was Emerson? And he said, Unitarian, now Unitarian Universalist. And I said, do they still exist? And he said, not only do they exist, there's a church out on the west side. I'm a member. Do you want to go on Sunday? And I said, of course. And I never looked back. 54 years ago. So, where this all comes really to a head for me today, so I'm not preaching from another age and dropping it on you, is that in 1872, Emerson is showing the early signs of dementia. The last 10 years of his life, he lived with his dementia progressing. His daughter, Ellen, had to travel everywhere with him because they were never sure where he was going to go or what he was going to say. And she would often stand at the side of his lectures mouthing the words from a manuscript of what he was supposed to say because he could remember. So October 1872, he's asleep at night and he hears a crackling in the walls of his house. And he wakes up and realizes the house is on fire. He runs downstairs, he runs into his office, he begins grabbing books and papers, shouting for Lydian and for Ellen to come and help and to notify all the neighbors. And in those days, everybody in Concord had a bucket full of sand, and that's what they would use when somebody's house caught on fire. There was another fire of any sort. So they all come running, and half the people are spending their time throwing sand on the fire. The other half are running into his study, saving his papers and his books, because they all realize this man is an international figure. And they understand the value of saving what was his, which is one of the reasons why today, if you go to a lot of the libraries, the Massachusetts Historical Society, you can read Emerson and his journals and all his papers, because these people saved everything that was his. He was devastated. Devastated. And all of his friends knew he needed to get out of town, just like when his first wife died. So they took up a collection, similar to what you did for me when you sent me off to the Galapagos, except I wasn't in that bad of shape. He really wanted to go to Egypt. He wanted to study ancient religions. He wanted to see the pyramids. So he goes there, and he and Ellen go down to the boat. They get on a steamship in Boston called the Wyoming. And after a day at sea, they realized all the other passengers on the ship are Orthodox Christian missionaries going to India to convert Hindus to Christianity. And they have to listen to hymns all the time. They listen to 2 sermons a day. And at one point he writes Linnea not to worry, because the liberal ocean sings louder. And one day we will all be one church. The liberal ocean sings louder. Think about what that means for us today. Emerson wanted nothing to do with this neo-orthodoxy that he felt Unitarianism at that time was beginning to slip into. He wanted to create a liberal ocean that sang loud, that was wide, that was all-embracing. He wanted to reimagine, he wanted to reconstruct the Orthodox dictionary and come up with new understandings, meaningful understandings of liberal Christianity for all people, not just some people. This was a period where dogma and doctrine was just being created constantly. He wanted nothing to do with that. And he was really disappointed that the Unitarians were beginning to lean into that. And so he said, the liberal ocean will sing louder. We must sing louder. As a tiny faith community, in a nation that is moving away from liberal democracy, we need to sing louder and create one country, one church. We need to begin reimagining our understanding of who we are as a nation and who we are as a community, why it was important we have JPEG, why it is important we passed Article 2, because it kept opening up and creating more opportunities for more people to become part of this faith. This is our promise. This is Waldo's dream. Let us fulfill it. Amen.